Hi, and welcome to Gender Speaker Live, the show where we're talking about all things gender. And today I'm going to be talking about the Equality in Human, basically Equality Act of 2010. Hi, so let's be looking now. I'm not going to make this all stuffy and all about difficult details on the law. The Equality Act is like 750 pages, a really big tome, and I'm not going to get the detail of that. I want to get to just a sense of what it's all about and some of the important elements of it, because its history was a bit fraught, just to get that right. So let me just talk a little bit about the background of where it all came from and what happened, because it's 10 years, well, 20 years ago now since it all started. And so a lot of that got lost. And I'll explain to you why. The first part of this whole thing, 1997, Tony Blair brought New Labour into power, and the Equality Act was a huge, big part of their manifesto, bringing about equality, major flagship policy. And this was never going to be a short-term piece of legislation. It was going to take a lot of time because, to be perfectly honest, equality law in the United Kingdom in 1997 was a mess. There were different rules for different strands and all sorts of different pieces of legislation. It was in all sorts of different acts, had little bits in it. If you were a black, disabled, lesbian woman and you were discriminated against in 1997, you would have had a problem. First of all, you had to decide, were you discriminated against because you're a woman? If so, Equal Opportunities Commission. Was it because you were black? Race Relations Board. Was it because you were disabled? Disability Rights Commission. Was it because you were gay? You're screwed. There was no commission for those. So some things were protected, some things weren't protected. Commissions did different things. All of the legislation for each of those different strands was completely different. Sometimes conflicting with each other. So it needed to be really, really pulled together. What happened was Labour did some small changes first. As far as I was concerned, the first thing that happened was in 1999, following a European Court of Human Rights. Yes, no, not a Court of Human Rights. No, it's European. Anyway, a European Court of Justice decision. It became illegal to discriminate against somebody in employment on the grounds that they were transgender. So the Sex Discrimination Act was changed so that I could actually not be fired just because I was transgender. Up until that time, it often happened. People came out and that was it, fired straight away. So suddenly you couldn't do that. You couldn't fire, you couldn't refuse to recruit because someone was trans. And then that was very quickly followed by a similar piece of legislation so that you couldn't fire or sack someone just because they came out and they were gay. So those were the first changes. And then the next big change that came along from that was the Equality Act of 2006. Now, this tidied up a few things, but the most important thing that this did was to basically scrap all of the old commissions and create one new big mega commission, the Equality and Human Rights Commission, with a big budget and a big task. Its job was to look at all of the equalities law, research all people, get all the information together, and work with the Equalities Office to create this new big Equality Act for 2010. That was the goal. Extensive consultations took place all over the country, and that's where I got involved. I just finished my master's degree, suddenly found that because of the changes in trans law, I was being asked to sit on various committees and get involved in all sorts of aspects of things. I've always been quite good with law, so I quickly brushed up on what was happening and got out onto the road shows and met Trevor Phillips and talked to things, got involved with the Equality and Human Rights Commission, because they were then in the process now of looking at what kind of support and background and trying to understand, so that they couldn't, for example, at one point they needed to find out the problems facing very elderly trans people, and they just couldn't get a consultation together. Well, I was able to get a group of very old trans people together in Yorkshire as part of that consultation to give them input into the process of defining the legislation. So all of that then continued, and then finally the Equality Act 2010. Went all the way through, and on April the 7th, 2010, it received royal assent. And we were so, well, no, we weren't ecstatic, because what happened on that day overshadowed everything, and the Equality Act vanished. Didn't actually not happen. It did go through, but it vanished. And it vanished because Gordon Brown, the then Prime Minister, called a general election, an election which he lost. So by the time we got to May, when the election took place, now we had David Cameron as Prime Minister, backed by the Liberal Democrats. The Labour government, the Conservative Party, never been fans of the Equality Act, battled all the way through to stop many of the changes. They really didn't like it at all. And there was even fear at the beginning that because now we had this change of government, they might scrap it altogether. I think the Liberal Democrats managed to stop that from happening, because it was a Liberal Democrat who became the first minister to, sorry, her name's gone completely from my mind. She was the first equalities minister to help to post this through. But the problem was it actually became law in October of that year. That was when it came into force. And hardly anybody was interested. It had gone. It had never been talked about. It just came into being. There it is. The Equality Act's there. It's now in law. There was no big hoo-ha. There was no... the Equality and Human Rights Commission were doing their best, but the austerity program was in place. Their budgets have been slashed, and I mean slashed. They were about they literally lost about 3/4 of their budget. So the most that they could do now was not really educate and train everybody. They were just about able to carry on doing the work that was needed to maintain what was going to happen. So let's have a look at the Equality Act now. I'm going to share screen and just we'll have a look at what this all means and take you through what the Equality Act does and how it works in very simple terms. I'm not going to get complicated in this, but we'll see how we go. And feel free to ask a few questions if you're around. I'm happy to keep that going. Let's just take a look. So there's the first thing. The first thing that the Equality Act did that transformed everything was to create what are now called protected characteristics, and there are 9: age, disability, gender reassignment, marriage and civil partnership, pregnancy and maternity, race, religion and belief, which includes no religious belief. So you have a right to not believe in a religion. That's really important. Sex, huge challenge over this. Was it sex? Was it gender? I haven't sorted that out. They're still got a mess. It became sex because this was basically the Sex Discrimination Act section put into the Equality Act, and then sexual orientation. So there are the 9 characteristics. Now, what it essentially says is you can't discriminate against somebody on the grounds of any one of those protected characteristics. So you can't discriminate against somebody on the grounds of age. But actually, yes, you can. In fact, we set up laws that say that, there are certain ways in which you can discriminate. You cannot, you can't buy cigarettes and smoke cigarettes under the age of 16. You can't buy alcohol under the age of 18. You've got to retire at 65. No, we can't really afford that. We've got to retire at 67. But when I'm running my workshops, I have a bit of fun with this because I actually think that retirement is eventually going to disappear. The age at which you should be retiring is being pushed and pushed and pushed. And it's getting more and more difficult. And we've already equalized it. Men and women are now beginning to retire at the same age. But frankly, the problem is that the retirement income is paid for out of current taxation. And we're going to have all sorts of problems, aren't we, after COVID with all the money that's been... They're going to be looking for ways to shift this. You watch the age of retirement start to move again. Anyway, so we can bring in regulations that allow discrimination. It isn't about no discrimination. It's about, but you can't simply discriminate. You can't actually say, no, you can't have a job because of your age, unless you can show clearly that there is a good reason for that and there's no other way to be able to deal with it. There are 1 or 2 things where there's a conflict. So let's just take religion and belief for a second. Some people argue that their religion, their belief says that homosexuality is a sin and therefore shouldn't be allowed. So they don't want anything to do with that. So somebody who might have a very strong Catholic view might run a guest house and says, no, on not having homosexual people in my guest house. Well, actually, our laws override religious belief, so they have to. And this is where it becomes a bit of a conflict. Religious belief cannot override that. Now, what they can do is they can create something, and this is what's happened in Cornwall, where somebody challenged this particular law, and the courts have said, no, if you run a religious retreat specifically for members of your specific religion, not just anybody who's religious, but it has to be specifically for your religious belief, then you can exclude somebody who's gay, because people who are gay will not be members of that religious belief. Take, for example, another thing. A Catholic organization might say, well, we want to, we're going to recruit priests. Well, they can say, no, now, if you want to become a Catholic priest, you have to accept the Catholic belief that we disagree with homosexuality. So we will not recruit somebody who is basically gay as a priest. Now, we know that actually does happen, and they just turn a blind eye to it. But officially, they can say our official policy is nobody who's gay. At the same time, if a Catholic church was, let's say, advertising for somebody to come in as an accounts clerk, well, they couldn't say no gay staff for this, because being gay has got nothing to do with their ability at accounts. Doesn't affect the way that they do that. So you've got to be very clear that if you exclude someone who has a protected characteristic, it must be able to show that there's absolutely no other way that you could handle this. We know there's conflict, and those conflicts are dealt with in that sort of way. So I'm not going to go into too many details, but can you see the issue? There are conflicts on these, but overriding this is a general principle. You cannot discriminate against somebody on the grounds of one of these protected characteristics unless you can clearly demonstrate that not discriminating would actually be of a disadvantage to the people that you serve. So let's just have a look then at gender reassignment. Why it was gender reassignment. It's the only characteristic that isn't actually a characteristic. Yeah, we all have age. This is the whole great thing about the Equality Act. It's no longer different groups of people who are protected. Everyone is protected. We all have age. We all have a religion, or we don't have a religion. It doesn't matter. Yeah, somewhere around we all have a belief or lack of belief, and all of that is protected. We all have a sexual orientation. We're either gay, we're straight, we're pansexual, whatever. We all have a sexual orientation. We don't all have a gender reassignment. What we do have is a gender identity, and that is what should have been protected. My gender identity, because if that had been protected, that would have allowed protection then to automatically be available to people who are non-binary. As it is, non-binary people have to fit into a bit gender binary, and it doesn't work very well. So this whole area is one of the areas that we would like reviewed, trans community. But there are other people who want to try and take back, unravel some of these rights. So it's a bit of a battle. This is the rule that used to exist before the Equality Act. Planning to undergo, is undergoing, has undergone a medically supervised process of gender reassignment. The Equality Act said, get rid of medical supervision, it's personal. Well, that changed everything. You don't have to have seen a doctor to be protected by law now. You don't have to have started a process for surgical treatment or hormone treatment. All you have to do is gone to see a counsellor, told a friend, told your parents, I think I have a problem with my gender. Start cross-dressing. Any of those things demonstrate that you are planning to undergo, are undergoing, or have undergone a process of gender reassignment, because there's no requirement that you complete it, just that you start it. So everybody's protected on this. And as you'll see later on, there are other factors which mean you're also protected by other directions. But this is the big thing, that pretty much anyone who's struggling with their gender identity is automatically protected, despite the archaic wording. So what about discrimination? Well, it's not just straightforward discrimination. So I'll quickly go through these. Direct discrimination is, I remember when I first came to London in the 1960s, I couldn't believe it. Up in the windows of some of I was looking for a flat to rent when I first came in 1969, and there were notices up. no blacks, no Irish, no dogs. I mean, utterly and completely despicable that people would do that, but that was allowed then. That was where we were in 1969, the height of the hippie era and flower power. But yeah, you can't do that now. You can't even say that Scottish daily required. You've actually got to be able to clearly demonstrate any level of discrimination and specifically require that. So you can't say no trans people here, no gay people. That's absolutely forbidden by the Equality Act. Indirect discrimination is a little more complicated. This is where your organization has set up some general rules that apply to everybody, but because of a protected characteristic, certain groups of people are disadvantaged by that rule. Let me give you a classic example for trans people, because this is what we're dealing with, and I don't want to go into it. The police used to have a requirement for height. Men was at, I think it was 5'9", and women was 5'7", 6, whatever. I can't remember the exact heights, but anyway, there were different heights, a minimum height for men, minimum height for women. Well, trans men came along and said, "Hey, this isn't fair. My average height is going to be the average height of a woman, but because I'm a trans man, I have to comply. I meet the women's height restriction, but I don't meet the men's height restriction." And so the police removed the height restriction because it was discriminatory. Now, the next two are really, really important. Indirect discrimination doesn't come out too often, but just important. If having a step at the front of your office, for example, just one thing, having a step at the front of your office means the building is no longer accessible for people who are in wheelchairs. Having something, the office up on the first floor but no lift. These are the sorts of things which create indirect discrimination problems. If you cannot provide an alternative means for somebsomebody without loss of dignity to be able to, access the service and access the building. So let's have a look at associated discrimination. This all started because a woman had a son with cerebral palsy, and it was quite bad. And a lot of people found it uncomfortable. His voice was difficult for him to communicate well. Lots of spittle and lots of anyway, he was good. It was a difficult case, and a woman was taking the son to a day center where he was really enjoying it, but other people found it uncomfortable, which they sometimes do. And they couldn't directly discriminate against the young boy with cerebral palsy. So what happened was the manager decided cleverly he'd ban the mother from coming. Well, she went to court on this, and the court said, "No, that's stupid. This is an attempt to discriminate directly against one person by discriminating against someone who you think hasn't got a protected characteristic." So that was the end of it. So associated discrimination was now built into this legislation. What it means is, if you associated with someone, so if you and I were going out for a drink and somebody discriminated against you because you were with me, you would have the same rights as if you were trans. Okay? It's as simple as that. Associated discrimination means that a person without that protected characteristic automatically is assumed to have it if they're discriminated against as a result of an association with someone with it. So if I'm with somebody who is black or Asian and we're both discriminated against, I get the same rights that they do. Perceived discrimination this is where somebody thinks you have a particular protected characteristic. So I know of some women who are quite big. Yeah, they're 6'2", a little bit masculine looking. And they tell me they quite frequently get people think that they're, or make comments about as if they are transgender. Well, they're not. But if they're discriminated against because somebody thinks they're transgender, then by law, they are given the rights as if they were. And basically, now they're in a position where they could be treated. There's a story about two men who went out for a night out dressed as schoolgirls. And a bunch of lads decided they were going to have a go and attack them. Now, here's the thing. They were actually just ordinary straight guys dressed up, but because people shouted out abuse like tranny as they were coming down and attempted to hit them, that would have been a hate crime against them as trans people even though they weren't, because they were perceived to be. Now, the truth about this story is it turned out a bit differently, because the two guys in schoolgirl outfits happened to be cage fighters, and the thugs who tried to attack them got a right pasting that night, which I thought was extremely funny. But the point is that had they not been like that, they would have been fully entitled to make a claim that that was a hate crime, and I'm going to look at hate crime in a minute. So they would have been protected under the law. So just to understand that, it doesn't matter if you are, or somebody thinks you are, or you're connected with somebody. Can you now see that what the Equality Act did was, instead of taking these small little groups and now everybody's protected. Potentially everybody could make a claim through gender reassignment, because if I'm out and my kids are discriminated against, they're protected because they're with if they're discriminated against because they're with me. If somebody thinks someone's trans because they just happen to wear, now this affects people who are, for example, non-binary. Somebody who's non-binary, who's wearing very, very feminine clothes. Maybe people might think they're gay or think they're trans. Well, if people think they're gay, think they're trans, treat them and discriminate against them because of that, the law says, fine, we'll treat you as if you are. And they forget all the same rights. Positive action, just going to very briefly cover this. Positive discrimination is as illegal as negative discrimination. So you can't suddenly say, well, we and this actually happens in a very positive way on organizations. So we don't have much representation in our staff of, say, Muslim, from the Muslim community or from the LGBT community. So we need to recruit more Muslim and LGBT staff. Well, you can't then just say, okay, fine, these next jobs are only available to LGBT and Muslim staff. You've got to be more careful about this. So what you can do is say, particularly, we would welcome job applications from people who are Muslim or LGBT. When you go through your assessments and interviews, once you've got people who all qualify properly for the job, you can then look at your final list and think, okay, we've got 3 people here that we could employ, all of whom meet the criteria we're looking for. One of them is Muslim, and we particularly like to actually have more Muslim staff, so we'll take them. So you can use it as a final selection criteria. You can't use it as the in a discriminatory way in terms of application. So that's positive action. Got to be very careful. Talk to HR before you do this. Victimization. If somebody is being discriminated against, and makes a claim, if they've got harassment going on in the office and they make a claim, and then pressure is put on them to withdraw that claim, that's victimization. So any attempts to try to stop people from taking action to prevent discrimination, harassment, and victimization, that becomes victimization. Harassment, let's look at that a little bit more detail, because this is really important. The harassment law is really quite strict and most people don't get it. So let's just quickly look at it. Harassment occurs when someone engages in unwanted behavior which is related to a relevant protected characteristic. So within the Equality Act, it has to be harassment on the basis of a protected characteristic. So somebody shouting fag, shouting tranny, calling out somebody because they're a Muslim, calling somebody negatively because they're black. All of these are harassment. Physical violence is also harassment. Sexual assault, that's all part of harassment law. It's covered by other laws as well, but as far as we're concerned, and which has the purpose or effect of violating a person's dignity or creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the person. Now, this is a real challenge here. Almost anything you do could create because bear in mind, this is not just about an individual person. If you're sitting in the office and having a bit of a laugh about somebody because they happen to be learning disabled, for example, Down syndrome, and somebody makes a bit of a joke and it's a little bit of a laugh and it just dismisses. If in the office at the same time is someone who has a child or a brother or a sister who is Down syndrome and feels really uncomfortable as a result of those comments, feels that they no longer can be open in the office. They can no longer talk about their sister, brother, child, because they feel that there is a generally negative attitude towards disabled people. If somebody has a partner who is trans, and somebody's talking about a partner who's gay. I've known somebody who was at a college, girl talking about in a very homophobic way because there was a gay lecturer. A person was unable to allow their gay partner to collect them from the college because they were worried that if they became clear that they were in a relationship with someone who was gay, that would ultimately mean that they would get talked about behind the back, they would get discriminated, they would get excluded from discussions. All of those things are about creating an intimidating, hostile, degrading, humiliating, or offensive environment for the person. So can you see that almost anything you do that is negative towards someone who has a protected characteristic in the way that you talk about it, and banter, in jokes around the office, in jokes in the environment, that's going to create an environment which is negative. And that means that what you're doing is harassment. And you can be charged with it. It can be a criminal offense if it involves physical attacks or threats of physical attacks. I think we all have to be very, very careful. It's important to stand up, stop it. If you hear it, block it and stop it. I'll just quickly go on to the protection for harassment. Also is covered by the 1997 Protection from Harassment Act, but that covers everybody, not just people with protected characteristics. So I'm not going to go into more detail about that. I'm just looking at the background. A hate incident is a non-crime incident perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on a person's sexual orientation or on being transgender. So that's a hate incident, calling somebody a name, putting a humorous joke, a poster up on the wall, all sorts of things like that, which actually, issues which are harassment can be considered a hate incident. It's reportable to the police. They want to know. A hate crime is where that incident is actually a criminal offense. So if somebody is threatened, physically attacked, punched, pushed, made to feel, really made to feel under serious threat, a victim of, so any criminal offense which is perceived by the victim or any other person to be motivated by hostility or prejudice based on sexual orientation or transgender, that becomes a hate crime. Now, the important thing about a hate crime is the penalties for the offense are doubled. And it means it's much more quickly followed up. If you report a hate crime, you will get very, very quick responses to it. I've got more stories I'm going to tell in the future, but for the time being, that's where we're going to finish. Just wanted to finish off by saying mispronouncing, referring to me as Mr. Instead of Ms. Or MX. Using my name that I had before I changed gender, or purposely doing it. And there's some surveys showing that 3 out of every 5 people purposely misgender or dead name people who are transgender. That is considered to be harassment. Keeping on doing it, just accidentally is one thing, but just keeping on doing it over and over again, not available. So let's get back to me here. I hope that's been useful. I hope you could read that. I didn't realize I have to go off screen before so somebody can see it. Anyway, there we go. That's the introduction to it. Tomorrow, I'm going to be carrying on talking a little bit about the Equality Act, because I want to talk about the public sector equality duty. Now, this is a specific part of the Equality Act, which is where you can actually hold government bodies to account and make them act more fairly. Remember, the foundation behind the Equality Act is creating a fairer society. That's the whole goal. It's not about picking on minorities. It's about making sure people are treated fairly, and everything is judged by that basis. Create an environment where everybody's included, everybody's treated fairly, everybody gets the same deal. So tomorrow, 4 p.m, I shall be talking a little bit more, and we'll be looking on the public sector equality duty, really important part of the Act. And hope you've enjoyed today. I hope it's made a lot of sense. And I hope it wasn't too boring. I know it's all about law. But anyway, see you again tomorrow. Take care.